World War II is often remembered for massive daytime clashes, carrier battles, bombing raids, and decisive landings. Yet one of the most important turning points in the Pacific War unfolded not under the sun, but in darkness. The night air battles between Japan and the United States marked a dramatic shift in how wars were fought, how technology decided outcomes, and how air superiority could quietly determine victory. These battles did not just change tactics, they changed the balance of power in the Pacific. On a humid Pacific night in 1942, the war between Japan and the United States slipped into a new phase, one that neither side fully understood at the time. The ocean was black and restless, the horizon invisible, and above it aircraft moved not by sight, but by signals, pulses of energy flickering through the darkness. What unfolded in the skies over the Central Pacific most clearly during the night air battles of the Guadalcanal campaign revealed something that would redefine modern warfare: the decisive power of radar and integrated technology. This was not a single dogfight or a cleanly labeled engagement, but a series of night actions in which American forces learned how to see in the dark while Japan, still relying on human eyesight. Courage and experience began to lose an advantage it had once held with confidence. At the start of the Pacific War, Japan possessed what many considered the finest naval aviators in the world. Their pilots were superbly trained, their aircraft agile and long-ranged, and their doctrine emphasized initiative, skill, and aggressive spirit. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was a triumph of planning and execution, carried out with minimal technological assistance beyond radio coordination. In those early months, Japan's air power advanced almost unchecked. The United States, by contrast, entered the war with less combat experience and a navy still adjusting to the reality that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would dominate the seas. Yet hidden within the American system was something Japan had not fully embraced: radar, and more importantly, the organizational mindset to integrate it into combat operations. The struggle for Guadalcanal in mid to late 1942 became the testing ground for this transformation. The island itself was strategically vital, but the air and sea battles surrounding it were even more significant. Japanese forces attempted repeatedly to bombard American positions and supply routes under cover of darkness, believing night operations would neutralize American numerical advantages. Their pilots and ship crews were trained to operate at night, using visual cues, moonlight, and disciplined formations. For years, this approach had worked well. The Japanese Navy in particular prided itself on night fighting skill, seeing technology as secondary to human mastery. The Americans initially suffered under this doctrine. Early night engagements were confused and costly, with friendly fire incidents and missed opportunities. Radar screens were unfamiliar, cluttered with false returns, and many commanders distrusted what they could not see with their own eyes. But necessity forced adaptation. As Japanese night raids intensified, American ships and airfields began to rely more heavily on radar, not just as an early warning device, but as the central nervous system of defense. One of the most important shifts occurred when radar was linked directly to fighter control. Instead of pilots patrolling blindly in the dark, American controllers aboard ships and at island-based command centers began guiding fighters toward incoming Japanese aircraft using radar vectors. This was revolutionary. For the first time, pilots could be steered to an enemy they could not yet see, positioned precisely for interception. The night sky, once a cloak of invisibility, became a mapped space of coordinates and ranges. A typical night battle during the Guadalcanal campaign followed a pattern that would soon become standard. Japanese bombers, often flying low over the sea to avoid detection, would approach American positions believing surprise was still on their side. Radar operators, scanning continuously, would detect these aircraft tens of miles out. The information flowed rapidly range altitude, bearing past to controllers who issued clipped instructions to waiting fighters. Engines roared to life, aircraft lifted into the darkness, and pilots followed voices over the radio rather than stars in the sky. For Japanese crews, the experience was unsettling. They found themselves intercepted seemingly out of nowhere, sometimes before reaching their targets, sometimes just as bombs were being armed. American fighters appeared suddenly out of the black, firing with deadly accuracy and then vanishing again. There were no flares, no searchlights, none of the familiar signals of a night engagement. It felt, to many Japanese aviators, as though the enemy possessed an unnatural sense, an ability to see without light. This technological edge was reinforced by improvements in aircraft design. American planes began to carry airborne radar sets, allowing pilots to locate enemy aircraft independently once close enough. Combined with radar-directed ground control, this created layers of detection and response. The Japanese, whose aircraft generally lacked radar and whose doctrine emphasized visual combat, were forced into a reactive posture. Skill and bravery remained, but they were no longer sufficient. The decisive aspect of these night air battles was not just the destruction of enemy aircraft, but the collapse of a strategic assumption. Japan had believed night operations would preserve its offensive capability despite growing American industrial strength. Radar shattered that belief. Night became just another environment, one in which technology, coordination, and production capacity mattered more than individual prowess. As the campaign continued, American losses decreased while Japanese losses mounted. Experienced Japanese pilots, already difficult to replace, were lost in growing numbers. Training programs could not keep pace, and the qualitative edge Japan once enjoyed eroded rapidly. Meanwhile, American crews gained confidence. Radar, screens that once seemed alien became trusted instruments. Controllers refined their techniques. Pilots learned to fight without visual contact until the final moments, and commanders began planning operations with the assumption that darkness no longer guaranteed safety. The psychological impact was profound. For American forces, radar offered reassurance and control in an otherwise chaotic environment. For Japanese forces, the night became unpredictable and hostile. Reports from Japanese pilots spoke of invisible enemies and attacks from nowhere. Language that reflected not superstition, but the shock of confronting a fundamentally new way of war. These night air battles also demonstrated the importance of systems thinking. Radar alone was not enough. Its effectiveness depended on trained operators, reliable communications, disciplined procedures, and leadership willing to trust data over instinct. The United States, with its industrial base and emphasis on standardization, was well suited to this approach. Japan, whose military culture prized individual excellence and decentralized initiative, struggled to adapt quickly. By the time the Guadalcanal campaign ended, the lesson was clear, even if not yet fully articulated. The future of warfare belonged to those who could integrate technology with human decision-making at scale. Radar turned information into power and power into victory. It reduced uncertainty, compressed reaction times, and allowed forces to operate effectively in conditions once thought uncontrollable. The night air battles between Japan and the United States did not end the war on their own, but they marked a turning point. From that moment on, Japan was increasingly fighting a technologically superior opponent whose advantages would only grow. Radar would soon be paired with better aircraft, improved weapons, and more sophisticated command networks. The gap widened with each passing month. In retrospect, what changed the war was not merely a device emitting radio waves, but a transformation in how war was understood. Vision was no longer limited to the human eye. Awareness was no longer local and momentary, but continuous and shared. The night, once a sanctuary for surprise, became a domain of precision and control. When historians look back on the Pacific War, the great carrier battles and island invasions often dominate the narrative. Yet in the quiet, tense hours of night over places like Guadalcanal, a deeper shift occurred. The United States learned how to fight as a technologically integrated force, and Japan encountered the limits of tradition in the face of innovation. The radar-guided night air battles did more than shoot down aircraft. They revealed the future of warfare, where information, technology, and coordination would decide outcomes long before opposing pilots ever saw each other in the sky. The night air battle between Japan and the United States revealed with brutal clarity the limits of Japanese aircraft design and aerial doctrine when confronted by an enemy that had learned how to turn darkness into an advantage. It was not a single clash, but a pattern of encounters that unfolded over the Pacific, particularly from 1942 onward, as American forces brought radar, equipped fighters, night fighting doctrine, and industrial adaptability into a contest that Japan had never fully prepared for. What emerged from these engagements was a hard lesson. Brilliance in daylight dogfighting and pilot courage could not compensate for structural weaknesses in technology, training philosophy, and strategic assumptions once the sun went down. Before the war, Japanese air doctrine was shaped by a belief in the decisive power of the individual pilot. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces emphasized agility, visual acuity, and aggressive maneuvering. Aircraft such as the Mitsubishi A6M0 were masterpieces of lightweight design, optimized for range and turning performance. These traits served Japan well in the opening months of the war, especially in daylight engagements where surprise, skill, and maneuverability dominated. However, this same design philosophy carried hidden costs. To achieve such agility, Japanese aircraft sacrificed armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and, critically, the electrical capacity and structural robustness required to support advanced electronics. These compromises mattered little in 1941. By 1943, they were fatal. Night air combat was fundamentally different from the swirling dogfights Japanese pilots trained for. At night, vision was limited, reaction time shortened, and engagements depended not on who could turn an opponent, but on who could find the enemy first. The United States learned quickly that radar was the key to this problem. Early in the war, American forces suffered from Japanese night harassment raids, particularly over Guadalcanal, where Japanese bombers, nicknamed Washing Machine Charlie, by exhausted Marines, dropped bombs at night to disrupt sleep and morale. Initially, American defenses struggled, but the response was not to rely on superior eyesight or daring maneuvers. It was to build a system. The Japanese approach to night operations remained rooted in improvisation. Pilots were expected to adapt their daylight skills to darkness with minimal specialized training. Night interception was often conducted visually, using moonlight, searchlights, or the glow of enemy exhausts. This method was unreliable and dangerous. Without airborne radar, Japanese pilots had to get dangerously close to identify a target, often too close to react effectively. Many night encounters ended with missed opportunities or collisions. The darkness did not reward bravery, it punished uncertainty. Japanese aircraft design further compounded these problems. Most Japanese fighters lacked the space, power supply, and stability required to carry effective radar sets. When Japan did attempt to develop airborne radar, it lagged years behind American technology. Japanese radar was heavier, less reliable, and produced weaker signals. Installing it often degraded aircraft performance, undermining the very agility Japanese designers prized. In contrast, American aircraft such as the P-61 Black Widow were designed from the outset as night fighters, with radar integrated into the airframe rather than awkwardly added later. The P-61 symbolized everything Japanese doctrine struggled to counter. It was large, heavily armed, and guided by radar operators who worked as part of a crew. This concept alone challenged Japanese thinking. Japanese fighters were single-seat aircraft built around the myth of the lone warrior pilot whose skill decided the outcome of battle. American night fighters, by contrast, treated combat as a coordinated technical process. Pilot, radar operator, ground controller, and searchlight crews worked together as a system. This systemic approach allowed American pilots to intercept Japanese aircraft long before the Japanese even knew they were being hunted. Training doctrine exposed another critical weakness. Japanese pilot training before the war was long and rigorous, producing exceptionally skilled aviators. But it was also inflexible and elitist. Once the war expanded, Japan struggled to replace its losses. There was little emphasis on specialized training for night operations, radar use, or crew coordination. Pilots were expected to learn on the job, often in combat conditions. American training, though shorter, was standardized, scalable, and adaptable. As night fighting became more important, the United States created dedicated night fighter squadrons and training programs. Japan did not. The night air battles over places like Rabaul, the Philippines, and later the Japanese home islands revealed how devastating this imbalance had become. When American B-24s and B-29s began flying night missions, Japanese defenses were overwhelmed. Interceptors struggled to locate bombers in the dark. Even when contact was made, Japanese fighters often lacked the firepower and durability to survive return fire. The absence of radar meant interceptions were late and poorly coordinated. Bombers passed through defensive zones largely unchallenged. Japanese attempts to adapt came too slowly. Some aircraft were modified for night fighting, such as the Nakajima J-1 Gecko, which was equipped with upward firing cannons inspired by German Schredge music tactics. These aircraft achieved some success, particularly against American bombers, but they were exceptions rather than the rule. Production numbers were limited, radar remained unreliable, and doctrine never fully shifted from visual interception to electronic detection. Each success felt heroic, but it did not scale. Another critical limitation was communication. Japanese night operations suffered from poor coordination between ground control and airborne pilots. Ground-based radar stations were sparse, vulnerable to attack, and often lacked the ability to vector fighters accurately. Radio discipline was inconsistent, and pilots were sometimes reluctant to rely on ground instructions, preferring their own judgment. This contrasted sharply with American ground-controlled interception systems, which directed fighters to precise positions using radar data. American pilots learned to trust the system. Japanese pilots were often left alone in the dark. Aircraft survivability was an especially unforgiving issue at night. Japanese fighters, lightly built and unarmored, were extremely vulnerable to surprise attacks. In daylight, agility could compensate for fragility. At night, when an enemy could attack unseen, it could not. American night fighters and bombers carried heavier armament and armor, allowing them to absorb damage and continue fighting. Japanese pilots frequently did not get a second chance. One burst of machine gunfire was enough to ignite fuel tanks or incapacitate the aircraft. Doctrine also failed at the strategic level. Japanese planners never fully accepted that air superiority required industrial and technological dominance as much as human skill. There was a lingering belief that superior spirit and courage could overcome material disadvantages. Night air battles shattered this illusion. Radar did not care about courage. Technology did not tire. American aircraft arrived guided by invisible beams, struck with precision, and vanished into the darkness. Japanese defenders often never saw their enemy. As the war progressed and American bombing intensified, the limits of Japanese night defense became catastrophic. B-29 raids over Tokyo and other cities exposed how ill-prepared Japan was for sustained night air combat. Interceptors rose too late, searched blindly, and were picked off or evaded. Searchlights and flak, once thought sufficient, proved ineffective against high-altitude bombers coordinated with radar. The night sky belonged to the side that could see without eyes. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was severe. Flying at night without radar, facing unseen attackers, and knowing that survival depended more on luck than skill eroded morale. This contrasted sharply with the confidence American crews gained from reliable equipment and coordinated support. Night air combat became less a test of individual bravery and more a demonstration of systemic superiority. Japan's doctrine had prepared its pilots for a different kind of war. In the end, the night air battle did not merely expose flaws, it demonstrated a fundamental mismatch between Japanese assumptions and modern warfare. Aircraft designed for elegance and maneuverability were outclassed by those designed for integration and resilience. Doctrine that glorified individual mastery failed against doctrine that emphasized coordination and technology. The darkness stripped away illusions and left only reality. The lesson was harsh but unmistakable. Japan entered the war with some of the finest pilots in the world, flying aircraft that were deadly in the conditions they were designed for. But war evolves. When it moved into the night, when electronics replaced eyesight and systems replaced instinct, Japanese aircraft design and doctrine could not keep pace. The night air battles were not just tactical defeats, they were revelations. They showed that the future of air combat belonged not to the most agile fighter or the bravest pilot, but to the force that could adapt its machines, its training, and its thinking to fight in any condition, even in total darkness. The night air battles between Japan and the United States marked a turning point in the Pacific War, not because of a single dramatic victory, but because they quietly and relentlessly altered the balance of power in ways that Japan could never fully recover from. These engagements unfolded in darkness, far from the dramatic carrier duels that often dominate popular memory, yet they reshaped strategy, drained resources, and exposed asymmetries in industrial strength, training systems, and technological adaptation. Over time, the cumulative effect of these nocturnal clashes shifted the war from a contest of daring and initiative into one of attrition and systemic superiority, a kind of struggle that overwhelmingly favored the United States. At the beginning of the Pacific War, Japan entered the conflict with a powerful offensive mindset. Its early victories were built on surprise, aggressive tactics, and pilots trained to an exceptionally high standard. Japanese air doctrine emphasized individual skill, visual detection, and close-range combat. These principles worked well in daylight engagements during the opening months of the war, when experienced pilots flying highly maneuverable aircraft could dominate opponents who were often less trained and tactically unprepared. However, night-air combat represented an entirely different environment, one where individual eyesight and flying skill mattered less than coordination, communication, and technology. As the war progressed, the United States increasingly turned the night into a weapon. Radar-equipped fighters, ground-controlled interception systems, and improved communications allowed American forces to detect, track, and engage enemy aircraft long before visual contact was possible. Night battles became less about finding the enemy by chance and more about methodically hunting them down. This shift gradually undermined Japan's ability to contest airspace, particularly around key island bases and naval formations. One of the most significant strategic consequences of these night battles was their impact on Japan's defensive posture. As American forces advanced across the Pacific, Japan relied heavily on night operations to compensate for its growing disadvantages in numbers and production. Night bombing and harassment raids were seen as a way to slow U.S. advances, disrupt supply lines, and avoid the increasingly lethal American daytime fighter screens. Yet these efforts repeatedly ran into a wall of radar-directed defenses. Each failed night mission meant lost aircraft, lost crews, and diminishing returns, while American losses remained comparatively low. This imbalance had profound strategic implications. The United States could afford to lose aircraft and crews in limited numbers and rapidly replace them. Japan could not. Every night battle that ended in Japanese losses weakened its ability to defend future positions. Over time, this erosion became cumulative. Bases that once had a credible night defense found themselves increasingly vulnerable. The night, once perceived as a sanctuary for Japanese operations, became another domain controlled by American forces. The strategic shift was also evident in the protection of naval assets. Early in the war, Japanese naval aviation posed a serious threat to U.S. fleets even after sunset. As radar-equipped night fighters became more common, American carriers and task forces gained a defensive shield that dramatically reduced the effectiveness of night attacks. Incoming aircraft could be detected at long range, intercepted before reaching launch points, or broken up so thoroughly that coordinated attacks became impossible. This reduced the threat to U.S. shipping and allowed American commanders greater freedom of movement. With their fleets more secure, U.S. strategists could plan operations with confidence that night attacks would not derail entire campaigns. This freedom was crucial during amphibious landings, where vulnerable transport ships and beachheads were prime targets. Effective night air defense meant that the United States could establish and sustain footholds across the Pacific, gradually tightening the noose around Japan's defensive perimeter. Another critical dimension of these night battles was their effect on pilot training and experience. Japan entered the war with an elite cadre of aviators, but its training system was slow and resource-intensive. Losses were difficult to replace, especially among specialized crews capable of night operations. Night flying required additional training, coordination with ground controllers, and familiarity with increasingly complex equipment. Japan struggled to expand these capabilities at scale, particularly as fuel shortages and industrial limitations worsened. In contrast, the United States transformed night air combat into an industrialized process. Training programs expanded rapidly, producing pilots specifically prepared for night operations. Ground crews, radar operators, and command staff were integrated into a system that treated air combat as a collective effort rather than an individual contest. This systemic approach meant that American effectiveness improved over time, even as the war dragged on. Each night battle became an opportunity to refine tactics, improve coordination, and exploit technological advantages. The strategic balance also shifted through the psychological impact of these engagements. For Japanese aircrews, the realization that darkness no longer guaranteed safety was deeply unsettling. Missions that once seemed relatively low risk became increasingly dangerous. The sense of initiative that had characterized early Japanese operations faded, replaced by caution and, in some cases, fatalism. Morale suffered as crews faced an enemy that could see them when they could see nothing in return. On the American side, success in night battles reinforced confidence and encouraged bolder operational planning. Commanders learned that technology and preparation could neutralize even a determined and skilled adversary. This confidence translated into sustained pressure across multiple fronts, stretching Japanese defenses beyond their limits. The night sky became a place where American advantages were most pronounced, reinforcing the broader strategic trend of U.S. dominance. These night battles also accelerated Japan's loss of strategic initiative. In warfare, initiative is not merely about attacking first. It is about forcing the enemy to react. As American night defenses improved, Japanese operations increasingly became reactive. Instead of shaping the battlefield, Japanese air units were forced to respond to American movements, often with inadequate resources and little hope of success. This reactive posture drained Japan's remaining strength without delivering meaningful strategic gains. The cumulative effect was a gradual but decisive shift in the overall balance of the Pacific War. By denying Japan effective use of the night, the United States closed one of the last avenues through which Japan might have offset its disadvantages. Daytime air superiority had already tilted in America's favor. Night air control completed the picture. Together, they created an environment in which Japanese forces were under constant threat, unable to rest, regroup, or maneuver freely. This shift had long-term consequences for the endgame of the war. As American forces approached the Japanese home islands, night air dominance enabled sustained bombing campaigns and reconnaissance operations. Defensive efforts were hampered by the same limitations that had plagued Japan throughout the later stages of the war. Insufficient radar coverage, inadequate night fighters, and a shortage of trained crews. The imbalance was no longer merely tactical. It was strategic and structural. In this sense, the night air battles did more than win engagements. They reshaped the nature of the conflict. They demonstrated that modern war was increasingly decided by systems rather than individuals, by integration rather than isolated excellence. The United States, with its vast industrial base and emphasis on coordination, was uniquely suited to this form of warfare. Japan, constrained by doctrine, resources, and industrial capacity, could not adapt quickly enough. The story of these night battles is therefore a story of momentum. Each engagement pushed the balance slightly further toward the United States. Each loss, each failed mission, each intercepted raid compounded Japan's difficulties. By the time the strategic consequences were fully apparent, it was too late to reverse them. The night, once a potential equalizer, had become another arena of American dominance. In the broader narrative of World War II, these engagements remind us that decisive shifts often occur not in single, dramatic moments, but through sustained patterns of advantage. The night air battles of the Pacific War quietly but relentlessly shifted the strategic balance. They undermined Japan's ability to defend its territory, protect its fleets, and project power. They reinforced American confidence, enabled offensive operations, and accelerated the collapse of Japanese resistance. Ultimately, the night sky became a symbol of the war's transformation. What began as a conflict shaped by daring raids and individual skill evolved into a contest of technology, coordination, and endurance. In that contest, the United States held the decisive edge. The night air battles did not merely reflect this reality, they helped create it, shaping the outcome of the Pacific War and signaling the arrival of a new era in aerial warfare.